1962, the Americans could not imagine the grave danger that was being formulated just a short distance beyond their borders. See, in 1960, America was going through a change. The troops were coming home from war. The civil rights was being discussed. And a change of government was taking place. This marked the day that the United States fought for its survival without firing a shot. It was perhaps the greatest victory that was never to be remembered. There were no hostile takeovers, no bombs bursting in the air, and no dead or dying servicemen being buried. However, the repercussions of failure or failing to act by our U.S. leaders during this time would have been costly. Today, I will be discussing the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 between the United States, the Soviet Union, and Cuba. Let's not make no mistake. This was a quest by the Soviet Union and its communist belief to gain a foothold by using its military tactics and the location of Cuba to strike the shores of the United States. There were three people involved highly in the Cuban Missile Crisis. President Kennedy. Kennedy became president of the United States once Eisenhower's term had ended. Fidel Castro overthrew Bastille's administration, then declared himself Cuba's new leader. And finally, Vladimir Khrushchev assumed the role of dictator after the death of Stalin. There were very tense moments between all three. It puts a lot of pressure on the U.S. during this time. But why was it a Cuban Missile Crisis? In 1961, the CIA planned a mission with the approval of President Kennedy to go to Cuba for a small invasion of men and assassinate Fidel Castro and take over his regime. The invasion ended quickly when the bombers missed their targets and several invaders were killed or captured. Following the failure of the CIA and what they called the Bay of Pigs invasion, Fidel Castro began to align himself with the leader of the Soviet Union, Khrushchev. They agreed during a meeting that they will begin constructing a number of missile sites starting later that summer in Cuba. The Cuban Missile Crisis, also known as October Crisis, was a 13-day confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union over Soviet ballistic missiles deployed in Cuba. President Kennedy found out that the Soviets and the Cuban dictator had made an agreement to put missiles on Cuban soil. President Kennedy did not like this at all. President Kennedy did not like the emergence of a Communist Party in the Western Hemisphere, and especially who had missiles only 90 miles off the southern coast of the United States. Something had to be done. President Kennedy wrote two important policies. During his response, he didn't make threats. He made a promise to the American people and to the Soviet Union. President Kennedy first, before any military activity happened, sent over spy planes to Cuba to verify that they had weapons of mass destruction. It was true and confirmed. Not only did they have sites or weapons of mass destructions, some missiles were already ready for fire. Some locations were already fully stocked and named Launch Site 1 by October 23, 1962. President Kennedy knew the distance between Cuba and America, and something had to be done. President Kennedy made a shipping lane using the Navy as a barricade to stop ships from entering Cuba's water. Tensions were high after the Navy stopped ship after ship, inspecting each ship, taking pictures, verifying if they had weapons of mass destruction, and if the ships had weapons of mass destruction, they were told to turn around. If they didn't, the president said the U.S. will sink the ships. President Kennedy and Khrushchev made one final policy. The policy was, if any missiles are fired from Cuba into the United States or in the Western Hemisphere, then the U.S. will retaliate by striking the Soviet Union. president wasn't sure of Khrushchev's response. So he spoke to the American families, telling them to build bomb shelters to protect themselves from atomic fallout in the event of nuclear exchange with the Soviet Union. In 1962, the Soviets finally agreed to withdraw weapons from Cuba. This event marked the closest the world had come to nuclear war. By this point, both the US and the Soviets recognized the concept known as mutual assured destruction, MAD. Both countries knew if one country had a nuclear attack, chances were good that the other would simply strike back. And the destruction of both nations would likely be the only outcome. President Kennedy and Khrushchev signed an agreement in 1964 that is still standing today. This was the only thing that kept both nations from attacking each other. That's my story. Thank you.